Can you guys hear me okay? Anybody there? All right, nice to see you. Good morning. It is 9:02, and we're going to get started, guys. So we just had our exam last week. So I graded all the exams as usual. Just make sure that you go through the exam. And if you have any questions, just send me an email with the question number, and I can always take a look at it, okay? So we are moving on. And today we're going to start and finish the respiratory system. And there's a lot of stuff that we need to talk about the respiratory system. It is a shorter, chapter, so we're going to cover in one class, which means that the quiz for this chapter is going to be open today, okay? And you're going to have until Sunday night to complete the quiz. And then on Thursday, we're going to start a new chapter. We're going to start the digestive system, which we're going to finish next week, Tuesday. All right? All right, guys. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, folks. So chapter 13 is all about the respiratory system. Folks, we're getting so close to the end. We are almost there, almost completing, finishing the semester. And for this chapter, we're going to talk about what we call the respiratory passageway. So what are the different structures within the respiratory system? What do they do? What is their function? We're going to talk about the anatomy of the respiratory system. Then I want to talk about the mechanics of breathing. How do we breathe? What is the process of breathing? How does breathing happen? We're going to talk about the transport of blood inside of the lungs and what happens once the blood is inside of the lungs. How do we exchange the gases? We know that the oxygen is going to go from the lungs into the blood vessel, and the CO2 is going to go in the opposite direction so that we can exhale the CO2. And then we're going to talk about the control of breathing and the role of surfactants inside of the alveoli, inside of the lungs. Okay? So let's start from the anatomy first, and then we're going to move on to the physiology. And we can divide the respiratory system, guys, into two major groups of organs. All right, we have what we call the conducting zone organs, so the organs of the conducting zone, and we have the organs and structures of the respiratory zone. Everything that is here in blue on this slide, they belong to the conducting zone, including what we call the terminal bronchioles. So all the way up here to the terminal bronchioles, they belong to the conducting zone. And as the name implies, conducting zone, all that these organs are doing, guys, they are transporting the air from point A to point B. Okay, so they're just pushing the air along the respiratory tract. It's not going to be until the air gets inside what we call the alveoli, which are tiny little air sacs inside of our lungs. It's not going to be until the air gets inside the alveoli in which we're going to have the exchange of gases between the lung and our blood vessels. Okay, so within the conducting zone, we have what we call the nose and the nasal cavity. And we're going to go over each one of these organs into more detail. Then we get into the pharynx, and we're going to see that the pharynx is divided into three different sections. We have what we call the nasopharynx, we have the oropharynx, and we have the laryngopharynx. Then we get inside of the larynx, and the larynx is the section right here where we're going to find our voice box. So we're going to find the structures that are involved with our speech, us being able to make sound. We have the trachea right here, also called the windpipe. And then after the trachea, we're going to find the bronchi. And we have three different sections of the bronchi. We have the primary bronchi, we have the secondary bronchi, and we have what we call the tertiary bronchi. Okay, all of these are little tubes deep inside of the lungs. And then after the tertiary bronchi, now we're going to get into the bronchioles. And the bronchioles are divided into the terminal bronchioles, and we have the respiratory bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles still belongs to the conducting zone, but the respiratory bronchioles belongs to the respiratory zone together with the alveoli. We have about 300 million alveoli, guys, in each of the lungs. And those little alveoli, and we're going to take a closer look at them, what they look like. Those alveoli, this is where, again, the exchange of gases is going to happen, and we need every single one of those alveoli. And they are very fragile. As the alveoli start to break down because of a disease, or because of smoking, or because of inhalation of toxins, then we're going to lose the function of our lungs. Okay, and the alveoli, they don't grow back. Once you lose the alveoli, they are gone. Your lungs are not going to make new ones. Okay? So let's go over each one of those structures of the respiratory system and see what they are and see what they do. So let's start with our nose. And the nose, in front of the nose, we have those two big holes right here. These are what we call the nostrils, or also called the nares. And they are going to allow the air to come in and out of the respiratory system. And we all know that our nasal cavity, which is the space behind the nose, it is divided into two, right? There's a wall called the nasal septum that separates the two nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity, the right nasal cavity and the left nasal cavity, they are covered, the walls of the cavity are covered with mucosa, with mucous membrane. What does this mucosa do? The mucosa is going to help to moisten the air, because the mucous membrane makes fluid, it makes mucus. It's going to moisten the air, and also is going to warm the air. And the mucus is going to help to trap pollutants, pathogens, fibers that is coming inside of our nasal cavity. Okay, it helps to trap them, preventing them from going inside of the lungs. Now, again, the nasal cavity is bilateral. We have the right nasal cavity and the left nasal cavity, and they are divided by what we call the nasal septum. And the front section of the nasal septum, right here, guys, this is made of cartilage. This wall right there in the front of our nasal cavity is made of cartilage. This is why we can move it around. But behind the nasal cavity, we're going to find the bony membrane, okay, bony tissue. So the nasal septum is made of both cartilage and bony tissue. Now, what happens when we have an allergy, or you have a cold and we have a runny nose? Well, what happens is that we have an inflammation of the mucous membrane that lines the nasal cavity. And inflammation, one of the hallmarks of inflammation is the overproduction of fluid. Okay, so the runny nose that we have is due to the inflammation of the nasal mucosa. Okay? All right, moving on. So we just talked about the nose and the nasal cavity. We talked about this section right here. Now let's talk about what we call the pharynx, also called the throat. Okay, the throat is a common name. The scientific name is the pharynx. Now, we don't have just one pharynx, folks. And when you're answering questions about this in an exam, you need to be specific, because the pharynx is divided into the nasopharynx, which is the pharynx behind the nasal cavity. We have the oral pharynx, which is the section of the pharynx behind the oral cavity. And we have the laryngopharynx, which is the section of the pharynx behind the larynx. All right. And if we can see right here, we're going to find the tonsils inside of our pharynx. We have tonsils right there in the nasopharynx. We have tonsil right here in between the nasal and the oral pharynx. And we even have tonsils behind of our tongue right there. Okay. So we know what the tonsils are. We know that the tonsils belong to what we call the lymphatic system. Is one of what we call the MALT, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And the function of the tonsils is that we're going to find white blood cells within the tonsils, and they are going to check for the air that is coming inside of our body. The tonsils are going to check for the whatever we're swallowing. As we can see here, as we inhale, the tonsil is going to pass right, the air is going to pass against the tonsils right here. As we swallow, whatever we swallowed is going to pass against these tonsils right here. All right. And when we have an inflamed tonsil, and that is due to we are fighting an infection, what's going to happen is that the tonsils will swell up due to the migration of white blood cells inside of the tonsils. And this condition is what we call tonsillitis. All right, moving on. So again, we talked about the nasal cavity and the nose, right here. Then we talked about the pharynx, and we know that the pharynx is divided into the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, and that within the pharynx we're going to find the tonsils. We have pharyngeal tonsils, palatine tonsil, and lingual tonsils. So now let's talk about what we call the larynx. And everybody look up here, please. The pharynx is just this section that I am highlighting right here. Okay, so that is the larynx. And within the larynx is what's going to connect the laryngopharynx with the trachea down below. And within the larynx, we're going to find a structure which allows us to be able to make sound, what we call the voice box. Okay? Now, there are some important structures that I want you guys to know that belongs to the larynx, that I do like to ask questions about it in the exam. And hopefully by now you believe me when I say that. And one of the structures is a big piece of cartilage right here at the top of our neck that we call the thyroid cartilage, aka the Adam's apple. Now, just FYI, it wasn't just Adam that ate the apple. Eventually, Eve also ate the apple, because it's not just guys that have an Adam's apple. Okay? Both male and females, we have a thyroid cartilage. Now, the thyroid cartilage of males are more pronounced, especially as we're going through our puberty. The production of testosterone does lead to the enlargement of the thyroid cartilage. And this is what's going to give males in general a deeper voice. Okay? Now, right below the thyroid cartilage, we're going to find another ring of cartilage that we call the cricoid cartilage. Everybody look up here, please. So we have the thyroid cartilage, which is this big piece of cartilage right here. And then below it, we have the cricoid cartilage. And we're only looking at the front of this cartilage right here because it goes around, okay? It's not just in the front, but it just goes around it. It makes like a C-shaped structure. Now, in between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, folks, there is a soft membrane, a soft tissue right here. I want everybody to look up. This membrane is what we call the cricothyroid membrane. And this membrane, and we can actually find it, if you touch your thyroid cartilage, guys, then run your finger right below it, and you're going to find a soft spot right there. That is the cricothyroid membrane. Why do we care about the cricothyroid membrane? We care about it. It is medically relevant because the cricothyroid membrane is a landmark for an emergency procedure called cricothyrotomy. What is cricothyrotomy? Cricothyrotomy, guys, is when someone is choking. Let's say someone ate a big piece of steak and he didn't chew properly and just swallow it. And now the steak got lodged right here, right between the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. That individual is choking. They can't breathe. The air can't pass through it. If you're lucky enough that you have a healthcare professional around you that know how to do a cricothyrotomy, what are they going to do? They're going to fill the cricothyroid membrane. They're going to take a knife or a scalpel, and they are going to make an incision right there in that cricothyroid membrane. And then they're going to take a tube, maybe they're going to take a pan and empty the pan and take the tube, and they're going to stuck that tube right there in that opening, right here. What are they doing? They are creating a bypass in your airways, allowing you to be able to breathe, allowing air to get inside and outside of your lungs, and effectively saving your life. Okay? That's what a cricothyrotomy does. Again, it's an emergency procedure to open an airway when someone is choking. Okay? Now, I also want to mention this, which a lot of people get this confused in exams. The larynx ends right here. The cricoid cartilage is the landmark, is the end point of the larynx, guys, right here. Because from this point down, we're going to have the trachea. It is not the larynx anymore. It is the trachea. Okay? So the larynx ends at the cricoid cartilage. And another structure of the larynx that I do want you guys to know is what we call the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is this flap of mucous membrane and cartilage right here. And the epiglottis has a very important function. The epiglottis prevents water, prevents food, prevents whatever is that we swallow from going inside the larynx. Okay, so what's going to happen? Every time that we swallow, guys, the epiglottis is going to come down. If you look up here in this little animation, every time we swallow, the epiglottis comes down and closes the opening to the larynx, preventing anything from going inside of the larynx. Instead, whatever we swallow will go down the esophagus down here. Okay, which eventually leads to the stomach. And this is why we cannot swallow and breathe at the same time. If you don't believe me, try. Swallow, hold your swallow, and then try to breathe it. You can't, because the epiglottis is closing our airways. All right, any questions, folks? All right. Now, we're still talking about the larynx, and I want to make sure you guys understand what you're looking at right here on the screen, folks. Everybody look up. This is a superior view of the entrance to the larynx. Right here, we can see the epiglottis, a little piece of the epiglottis. The epiglottis would look like this. Okay, this big flap that is standing up right now. And then, at the entrance to the larynx, we can see what we call the ventricular folds, also called the false vocal cords, to the side here. And then the sticker membrane, right there, guys. This is what we call our vocal folds, also called the true vocal cords. And then down here, we can see already the trachea. So this dark region right here, this dark tube, this is where the trachea is going to be. Now, how does we make a sound? And we're going to watch a little video in a minute. But the way that we make a sound, guys, is that the vocal folds will open and close. Okay? And as they open and close, air is going to pass right in between the vocal folds. And the air is coming from down, is coming from the lungs up, moving upwards, okay? And as the air passes in between the vocal folds will vibrate. And it's the vibration of the vocal folds that allow us to be able to make a sound. Let's say someone has an inflammation of the vocal folds, guys, and they have a difficult time speaking, and that is because these vocal folds here are swelling up. And if they swell up, that is going to make it difficult for you to be able to talk, to speak. Okay? So let's watch this video here. And it's a very cool video. We can actually see the vocal folds in action. And it's not for the faint of heart. No, it's not gross, but it is very interesting. If you've never seen a vocal fold in action before. Let me move ahead here. Okay.
Some people are prone to injuries, and some people.
All right, so we can see right there in the middle, the whitish color, that is the true vocal cords. And then to the side, anchoring the true vocal cords, we have what we call the ventricular folds, or the false vocal cords. Now watch how the vocal folds vibrate, they enlarge, they shorten, depending on the type of notes that we're making with our voice.
Lower the. Again. Okay, let go quick. Now louder. E. Okay, now glide from low to high.
Look how it stretches.
Good. Enough high to low.
Now it thickens.
The high and real soft.
And guys, look at again the vibration. If you ever played an instrument, like a string instrument, when you hit the instrument, okay, when you hit the instrument, we can see that the chord vibrating, right? That's exactly what's happening when we make different sounds. Okay. All right, moving on. So let's recap. We talked about the nose and the nasal cavity. We talked about the pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. We talked about the larynx. Within the larynx, we have the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the cricothyroid membrane, and the epiglottis. We also have our vocal box, which includes the true vocal cords and the false vocal cords. Now we are getting into the trachea. And again, the trachea starts below the cricoid cartilage, and the trachea goes all the way up here, down here, okay? Before the trachea splits into two. That's the trachea. The trachea is also what I call the windpipe. And what I want to do now, I want to take a cross-section of the trachea and have a superior view. This is what we're looking at right here, folks. We're looking at a superior view of a cross-section of the trachea, okay? And the trachea is here in the front. That is the trachea. And then behind the trachea, we're going to find the esophagus over there. All right, so we can see both the trachea and the esophagus as well. Now, if we take a little slice of the inner section of the trachea, the inner lining of the trachea, we can see that on the walls of the trachea, the cells, they have little hair-like structures that are called the cilia. We have talked about the cilia before. So throughout the entire trachea, in fact, continue down into the bronchi, we're going to have ciliated cells. What do those cells do? Why do we have the cilia, guys? The cilia helps to expel things out of our body. Let's say that we have a mucus that is trapped right here inside of the trachea. And the mucus is going to find, particles and pollutants and bacteria and gunk, a lot of this stuff in here. Do we want the mucus to go down into the lungs? No. Do we want the mucus to stay right there within the trachea? No. What do we want to do with the mucus, folks? We want to bring the mucus upwards so we can cough it out, spit it out, get rid of it. What allows the mucus to move upwards in the respiratory system is the cilia, a movement that is called the ciliary escalator movement. Not the ciliary elevator, the ciliary escalator. Okay? And take a wild guess what's going to happen if the cilia is destroyed, guys. In fact, this is one of your critical thinking questions for the final exam. What happens if the cilia is destroyed? If the cilia is destroyed, that individual is going to have more lower tract respiratory infection. Why? Because now the mucus with the trapped dirt and pathogens will go down inside of the lungs, causing lower tract respiratory infection. Now, I want you guys to understand here, and a lot of you folks do this mistake in exams. The cilia is not a filtration mechanism. This is not filtration. The cilia beats. The cilia moves. And as the cilia moves, the cilia pushes the mucus upwards. It is not filtering anything. It is pushing, getting rid of the mucus that is trapped within the trachea. Okay? Now, we can see right here that, and we're going to see this better in another view as well, but the trachea is formed by a lot of little rings of cartilage, folks. And these little rings of cartilage are what we call the hyaline cartilage, also called the C-ring structure, because it has the shape of a C. Now, I have a question for you. Everybody look up here, please. And here's the question, folks. Why is the hyaline cartilage in the shape of a C and not of an O? Why isn't the hyaline cartilage an O instead of a C-ring shape? Look at the screen right here and tell me.
Is it to give the area more flexibility when swallowing and whatnot? If the cartilage is all the way around, it makes it more stiff, I guess.
You're absolutely in the right track. Not that it isn't going to make it more stiff, but remember, what is behind the trachea, guys? The esophagus, right? Right here. Every time that we swallow, our esophagus needs to expand. Let's say again, you're swallowing a big piece of steak. Your esophagus will expand to accommodate the food that we're swallowing. Now, can you imagine if the hyaline cartilage was an O-ring, that would stop the enlargement of the esophagus. And whatever is that was swallowed will get stuck on that section of the hyaline cartilage right here behind it, right there. So it's going to impede the esophagus from expanding when we swallow. Okay, but we don't have that. So instead, what's going to happen is that every time that we swallow, the esophagus is going to be able to expand and it's going to take some of the space inside of the trachea. allowing, again, the food that should go down the esophagus. Okay? Any questions, folks? All right. Moving on, and everybody look at here again. And this is a much better view of the larynx and the trachea and the bronchi. I want to make sure you guys understand where is the larynx, where is the trachea, where is the bronchi. So as I said before, the larynx ends at the cricoid cartilage right here, which is the piece of cartilage right below the thyroid cartilage. That is the end of the larynx. From this point down, all the way until before the trachea splits into two, that is the trachea. And we can see that the trachea is made of all this hyaline cartilage right here, the C-ring structures. What is the function of this hyaline cartilage, folks? The hyaline cartilage keep the trachea open. That's what allows our trachea to stay open. Because on the walls of the trachea, there are no muscles, which is different from the esophagus. The esophageal wall, the esophagus wall has muscle, a smooth muscle inside. Okay? But there is no muscle within the trachea. And what keeps it open is the hyaline cartilage. If we remove the hyaline cartilage, the trachea would collapse, preventing the passage of air. All right. Now, as soon as the trachea splits into two, guys, now is not the trachea anymore. Now it is what we call the primary bronchi. By the way, bronchi is plural, bronchus is singular. And we have two, it is bilateral. We have the right bronchus and we have the left bronchus. Okay, and the bronchus is the tube that is entering inside of our lungs. Now, when this primary bronchus split into branches right here, now is going to become the secondary bronchus, or the secondary bronchi. And when the secondary bronchi splits into a smaller branch, now we're going to find the tertiary bronchi. So we have a primary, we have a secondary, and we have a tertiary. I want you guys to see the trachea and the bronchi like an upside down tree. You know, imagine a tree, okay? And the tree, we have the trunk of the tree, and then we have the branches of the tree, and then at the end of the branches, we have the leaves right here. I know it's not a great drawing, but that would be a tree. Now imagine an upside down tree. That's what the trachea and the bronchi looks like. And at the end of the bronchi, at the end of the tertiary bronchi, we're not going to have leaves. We are going to find what? We're going to find the alveoli. We're going to find the alveoli. Okay? Now, after the tertiary bronchi, now we get into the bronchioles. And remember, the bronchioles, we have two different types. We have the terminal bronchioles, which still belong to the conducting zone. And we have the respiratory bronchioles, which belongs to the respiratory zone. All right? Let's take a closer look at the lungs overall, and then we're going to dive inside of the lungs and take a closer look at the alveoli. But we can see right here, we all know that we have two lungs. The lungs are bilateral. We have the right lung and we have the left lung. I have a question for you. Are the lungs identical? Are the two lungs identical, guys? No. Which one is smaller, the left lung or the right lung? You probably can't see it here from the cartoon, but one is smaller than the other. Does anybody know which one is smaller?
Left.
The left, absolutely. The left lung is the smaller. Why? Why does it need to be smaller?
Space for other organs?
A space for what organ specifically?
The liver?
Not the liver. The liver is way down below.
Oh, wait, hold on.
What is sitting right here in the thoracic cavity, right next to the lungs, in between the lungs?
The heart.
The heart, absolutely. The heart is going to be sitting right here, guys. And that is the reason why the left lung is smaller, because most of the heart is positioned within the left thoracic cavity, which is going to take some space from the left lung. Okay? Now, if you take a look at the lungs here, we can see that the lungs have the shape of a triangle, just like the heart. And just like the heart, it's any triangle, we're going to have an apex and we're going to have a base. So here at the top, we have the apex of the lungs, and at the bottom, we have the base of the lungs. Okay? And if you take a closer look, the right lung has 3 lobes. We have a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. But if you take a look at the left lung, there are only 2 lobes. We only have a superior and an inferior lobe. Again, the left lung is smaller than the right lung. Now, the lobes of the lungs are separated by lines, what we call the fissures. And separating the superior from the inferior on the left lung, we're going to find what is called the oblique fissure, this line right here. And then on the right lung, we're going to find both a horizontal fissure as well as an oblique fissure, okay? The horizontal fissure is separating the superior from the middle lobe on the right lung, and the oblique fissure is separating the middle lobe from the inferior lobe on the right lung, right? Any questions? All right, so now let's dive deep inside of our lungs and let's take a look at the alveoli. But before we get to talk about the alveoli, let's take a closer look at the bronchioles. And remember, we have 2 different types of bronchioles. We have the terminal bronchioles and we have the respiratory bronchioles. Can anybody tell me, and every single one of you should be able to know this by now, so anybody can jump in, but can anybody tell me what would be the structure before the terminal bronchiole? Again, what would be the name of the structure before the terminal bronchiole? Backtrack, guys. We just talked about it. What is the name of the structure before the terminal bronchioles?
Epithelial cells?
No. I didn't talk about epithelial cells today. What is the name of the structure before the terminal bronchioles? What comes before the terminal bronchioles? Guys, look at the very first slide. Do you guys print this slide and have it in front of you and follow along? You have access to the slides, the PowerPoint slides.
The tertiary bronchi.
The tertiary bronchi, yes. Remember, we have a primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, then we come terminal bronchioles, and then branching off from the terminal bronchioles, we have the respiratory bronchioles. Again, just start connecting the dots, guys. It's not memorization, it's thinking, okay? Now, hanging from the respiratory bronchioles, we're going to find this tiny, tiny little air sacs, tiny little balloons of air. These balloons are what we call the alveoli. Alveoli is plural, alveolus is singular. And usually we have these alveoli, they come into little clusters. what we call the alveolar sac. So a group of alveoli. And remember, what is the function of the alveoli? In the alveoli, this is where the exchange of gases is going to happen. In the alveoli only. There is no exchange of gases anywhere else in the respiratory system but in the alveoli. So what I want to do now, and I need everybody's attention here, this is something that I do like to ask questions in the exam. I want to take a fill of these alveoli right here, and I'm going to slice them open. I'm going to take a knife, and I'm going to cut them open so we can take a look inside right here. So we are looking inside the alveoli. And the alveoli is made of different cells. The walls of the alveoli are made of epithelial cells. Okay, so we have all these epithelial cells forming the walls of the alveoli, and the alveoli is very thin. We are talking about 1 cell thick. That's the width of the alveoli wall. Guys, imagine, this sheet of paper here, if it was made of a single cell thick. That's how thin the alveoli are. And inside the alveoli, we're also going to find white blood cells. We're going to find macrophages in there. And macrophages can do phagocytosis, right? They are phagocytic cells. And the macrophages here, guys, they live inside the alveoli. This is what we call resident macrophages. My question to you is, why do we need macrophages inside our alveoli? What are they doing there? Usually the macrophages are blood cells. They usually stays within the bloodstream. They circulate in our bloodstream. Why? We're going to find macrophages that live in the alveoli. What do they do, guys? What do macrophages do?
To destroy bacteria that comes in through the airway.
Right, absolutely. Now here's the deal. Why do we need to have this macrophages that live inside of the alveoli? We need them in there because our respiratory system, guys, is directly exposed to the outside environment. Think about this, okay, for a second. Every time that we inhale, we take the outside inside. Most of the other organs in our body, they are protected from the external environment. They are protected. They're never going to see the external environment. But inside of our lungs, they are directly exposed to that external environment. So we need to have layers of protection. One of those layers of protection is having a mucous membrane that produces mucus in our nasal cavity and inside of our trachea. The mucus will help to trap pathogens, pollutants, fibers that are coming inside of our lungs. Then we have the cilia inside of the trachea. The cilia is going to push the mucus upwards. That's another layer of protection. And we have macrophages inside of the alveoli so that if a bacteria or a virus or whatever is that gets inside the alveoli, the macrophage will engulf them and destroy them, take them inside and destroy them. Another layer of protection. Okay? And finally, these green-looking things right here on the walls of the alveoli, these are cells called surfactant-secreting cells. What do they do? The name says it all. They produce a fluid, an oily fluid called surfactants. What is the function of this fluid, guys? And this, I will ask you questions about this in the exam. Surfactant lowers the surface tension of water to allow the exchange of gas to happen between the alveoli and the capillaries of the lungs, right here. Now, what do I mean by that? Lower the surface tension of water. Folks, we have water inside of the alveoli. How did that water get in there? From the air. Look, right now, this last few days, it has been very rainy, which means that we have a lot of moisture in the air. Okay, and every time that we inhale that water, the moisture will get inside of the alveoli. So we have water in the alveoli. Now, the presence of the water inside of the alveoli, it could be an inhibitor of gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood vessel. Why is it an inhibitor? It is an inhibitor because water is held together by hydrogen bonds. And the hydrogen bonds gives a surface tension of the water. What do we mean by surface tension? Look, if you ever watched a drop forming in an annoying faucet that is leaking, we can see how the drop starts to form and then it grows, and then eventually, when it's too heavy, it's going to drop down. But it is held together at the beginning. What is holding that drop of water together? Hydrogen bonds. So because of the hydrogen bond and that surface tension of water, that would inhibit the exchange of gases, the gas passing through the water from the alveoli into the blood vessel. But that doesn't happen because we create something called surfactant. And the surfactant in the lungs breaks down the hydrogen bonds of water and lower the surface tension of water, allowing gas exchange to happen. Now, do you know what happens with very premature babies? Very premature babies that are born before the time, they don't have functioning lungs yet because their lungs are immature and they don't produce surfactants. And this is why a premature baby needs help breathing. Oftentimes, they're going to be put into an incubator. They're going to put in a machine to help them breathe because they can't do it on their own yet because they don't have surfactant secreting cells. Okay, any questions, folks? All right. So we are done with the anatomy of the respiratory system. So from this point on, we're going to talk about the physiology of the respiratory system and how do we breathe, the mechanism of breathing, okay? And to talk about the mechanism of breathing, we need to talk about a fundamental physical law. And this law is what we call the Boyle's law. Now, don't stress out. This is a very, very easy law to understand. This is what the Boyle's law says, and I want everybody to write this down. Boyle's law says that at constant temperature, there is an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. I'm going to repeat that. At a constant temperature, there is an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. Let me show you what this looks like here, okay? Here we have a device, guys. This tube right here. And in this tube, we have air. So there's air right here. Now we can see that this tube, we can change the volume inside of the tube. We can go from 4, whatever unit that might be, to 2. Okay? Now, when we have a volume of 4 in this tube right here, we have this amount of pressure inside of the tube. So the pressure here is 1 millimeters of mercury. Millimeter of mercury is the unit of pressure. Okay? At a temperature of 300 Fahrenheit, let's say. Now, when I decrease the volume inside of the tube, when I go from 4 to 2, everybody look up here, the temperature is still the same, 300, But now take a look at the pressure. The pressure now inside of the tube is 2 millimeters of mercury. So we can see how we decrease the volume.
Do that house
And
every
when
second.
we decrease the volume, and when the volume was decreased, the pressure increased. And that's what Boyle's law says. When we increase the volume, the pressure goes down inside of the container. When we decrease the volume, the pressure is going to go up in the container. Okay, that's the inverse relationship. Now, how do we apply this to our breathing, inhalation and exhalation? I need everybody's attention here because I will ask you questions about this in the exam. Now, when we inhale, folks, this is what's going to happen, okay? We have a muscle right here below the lungs, and we have talked about this muscle before. This is what we call the diaphragm. When we inhale, we are going to contract the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is going to flatten. So you can see before inhalation, the diaphragm was the shape of a dome. But when we inhale and we're going to contract the diaphragm is going to come down and is going to flatten. When we flatten the diaphragm, we increase the volume inside of our thoracic cavity. So the volume inside of the lungs increases. Can anybody tell me what's going to happen to the pressure inside of the lungs if the volume increases, according to Boyle's law? So what's going to happen to the pressure inside of the lungs when the volume inside of the lungs increases, according to Boyle's law?
Decreases.
Decreases, absolutely. So when we increase the volume inside of our lungs, the pressure inside of the lung is going to decrease, guys. And when the pressure decreases, we create negative pressure inside of our lungs. What is negative pressure? Negative pressure is vacuum. If you ever cleaned your house, if you ever work with or used a vacuum cleaner, the way that the machine works is that it creates a negative pressure inside of the machine. And this is why the machine can suck the air inside, from outside inside of the machine. That is what happens inside of our lungs. We create a vacuum inside of our lungs. And that is going to be inhalation. The air is going to be pulled inside of the lungs. Okay? Now, how do we exhale? Well, for us to exhale, we need to relax the diaphragm. So now the diaphragm is going to go back to the dome position. The volume of our thoracic cavity is going to decrease, and the pressure inside of the lungs is going to increase. So now we have a positive pressure inside of the lungs. And that positive pressure inside of the lungs is going to push the air out of the lungs. And that is inhalation. Okay, everybody look up here. Can you see what I have here in my hand? This is a little, what we call a lung model. And I made this a couple of weeks ago. We had a discovery fair at Leeward Community College. And this is a little lung model that we can build with the kids. You guys can build with your own kids as well. And what we have here, we have a cup. Inside there is little balloons, okay? And here we have another balloon, and this is representing the diaphragm. When we take the diaphragm, guys, and we pull the diaphragm down, I want you guys to see what happens with the balloon. When it goes down, the balloon inflates. When it goes up, the little balloons deflate. So this is inhalation, exhalation, inhalation, exhalation, all due to the creation of a vacuum inside of the lungs. So when I create a vacuum, the lungs inflate. Okay, when I decrease the thoracic volume here, the lungs will deflate. Okay. Any questions, folks? All right. Now, besides the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is extremely important, but there's another muscle that is also involved with inhalation and exhalation. And that muscle is what we call the external intercostal muscles. Okay, where is this muscle? These muscles, guys, they are in between our ribs. In between every rib, there is a layer of muscle called the external intercostal muscle. When we contract the external intercostal muscle, what's going to happen is that we're going to have an increase in the thoracic cavity, and that's going to cause inhalation. When we relax the external intercostal muscles, now we're going to have a decrease in the thoracic volume, and that's going to lead to exhalation. Okay? Now, some movements, some involuntary movements of our lungs. Coughing. Guys, when we cough, this is because we got some foreign material inside of our trachea. Let's say that you are eating some rice and you are watching something funny, or someone said something funny to you and you laughed, and then a little grain of rice got inside of the trachea. Immediately, you're going to start coughing. And what the coughing is doing, this is an involuntary contraction of the diaphragm, trying to expel whatever is that got trapped inside of the trachea. Hiccups. What is a hiccup? Hiccup is an involuntary contraction of the diaphragm. It is a spasm of the diaphragm. Just like we have a muscle spasm and the muscle is contracting on its own, we can have involuntary contraction of the diaphragm leading to a hiccup. And then we have a yawning. And yawning is still a mystery to scientists. Scientists have spent thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hours studying, trying to understand why we yawn, and we still couldn't, really figure it out. There are many hypotheses out there. None of them is really very strong. One of the hypotheses, because we know that yawning is contagious, right? If I start yawning right now, I know that many of you is going to start yawning as well. And one of the hypotheses about yawning is that yawning seems to be an evolutionary process that help us to show compassion with the other people within our community. How do they figure that out? Well, what they did, the scientists did, they took kids, okay, like under the age of, between the age of 5 and 8, if I remember correctly, the experiment. And they had two different groups of kids. They have healthy kids, and then they have kids with ADHD. And we know that kids with ADHD and different, neurological conditions, one of the things that happens to them is that sometimes they don't show emotion. They don't show compassion for other kids. For example, if a kid can fall in the playground, they might not, have any emotion at all. And what they did is that, so they showed videos of people yawning to those two groups of kids, and then they counted how many times the healthy kids yawned when they watched the video, and how many times the other kids yawned. And they noticed that the healthy kids, they yawn more. And this is how they came up with the hypothesis that yawning, it could be an evolutionary process to show compassion with the other people around the community within, where we live. Okay, I don't know if I really believe that, but again, it's just a hypothesis. It hasn't really been proved beyond doubt. All right, guys, so let's watch this little video here about how do our lungs work.
There's nothing like earning more on purchases with Business Platinum. Many of us have hundreds of things on our minds at any moment, often struggling to keep track of everything we need to do. But fortunately, there's one important thing we don't have to worry about remembering: breathing. When you breathe, you transport oxygen to the body's cells to keep them working and clear your system of the carbon dioxide that this work generates. Breathing, in other words, keeps the body alive. So how do we accomplish this crucial and complex task without even thinking about it? The answer lies in our body's respiratory system. Like any machinery, it consists of specialized components and requires a trigger to start functioning. Here, the components are the structures and tissues making up the lungs, as well as the various other respiratory organs connected to them. And to get this machine moving, we need the autonomic nervous system, our brain's unconscious control center for the vital functions. As the body prepares to take in oxygen-rich air, this system sends a signal to the muscles around your lungs, flattening the diaphragm and contracting the intercostal muscles between your ribs to create more space for the lungs to expand. Air then whooshes into your nose and mouth, through your trachea, and into the bronchi that split at the trachea's base, with one entering each lung. Like tree branches, these small tubes divide into thousands of tinier passages, called bronchioles. It's tempting to think of the lungs as huge balloons, but instead of being hollow, they're actually spongy inside, with the bronchioles running throughout the parenchyma tissue. At the end of each bronchiole is a little air sac called an alveolus, wrapped in capillaries full of red blood cells containing special proteins called hemoglobin. The air you've breathed in fills these sacs, causing the lungs to inflate. Here is where the vital exchange occurs. At this point, the capillaries are packed with carbon dioxide, and the air sacs are full of oxygen. But due to the basic process of diffusion, the molecules of each gas want to move to a place where there is a lower concentration of their kind. So as oxygen crosses over to the capillaries, the hemoglobin grabs it up, while the carbon dioxide is unloaded into the lungs. The oxygen-rich hemoglobin is then transported throughout the body via the bloodstream. But what do our lungs do with all that carbon dioxide? Exhale it, of course. The autonomic nervous system kicks in again, causing the diaphragm to ball up and the intercostal muscles to relax, making the chest cavity smaller and forcing the lungs to compress. The carbon dioxide-rich air is expelled, and the cycle begins again. So that's how these spongy organs keep our bodies efficiently supplied with air. Lungs inhale and exhale between 15 and 25 times a minute, which amounts to an incredible 10,000 liters of air each day. That's a lot of work, but don't sweat it. Your lungs and your autonomic nervous system have got it covered.
All right, folks. All right, now I want to talk now about what we call the measuring ventilation. So we're going to talk about the function of our lungs. How do we measure lung function? Okay. And we measure lung function using a device, using a machine that is called a spirometer. And we can see here an old spirometer. It was a huge machine. It would occupy an entire tabletop. But now spirometers are very small. You know, it's like a little box in which we can breathe through a tube, and then we can inhale and exhale, and we can get a measure of our lung ventilation. And by measuring our lung ventilation, then a doctor can then can determine how well your lungs are functioning, if you have any type of lung disease, okay? So let's talk about lung volume and capacity. On average, folks, we breathe about 12 times a minute. Again, this varies from person to person depending on your level of activity, but on average about 12 times per minute. An average volume of a single breath, okay? Let's say when I inhale, I am going to take on average 500 mLs of air inside of my lungs with a single breath. If I multiply 12 by 500, I get what we call the minute ventilation. And a minute ventilation is about 6,000 mLs of air per minute. is going to go inside of my lungs. So 6 liters of air per minute. Now, not all of this air that gets inside of my lungs will actually go inside the alveoli. In fact, it's going to be just a fraction of that. We also have what is called the alveolar ventilation rate. And the alveolar ventilation rate is about 350 ml of air that actually goes inside the alveoli. So out of the 500 mLs of air that we take in with a single breath, only about 350 will actually reach the alveoli. So if you multiply 350 by 12, now we get the alveolar ventilation minutes, which is about 4,200 mLs of air per minute going inside the alveoli. Okay? Now let's talk about the spirogram and the spirometry. Again, what is spirometry? A spirometry is a measure of lung capacity. The same way that an ECG is a measure of cardiac cycle, we have a spirometry, which is a measure of lung capacity. Okay? How do we do a spirometry? If you need to do a spirometry, you're going to go to a clinic or a hospital. They're going to put you to sit down. They're going to take a little mouthpiece that is attached to the spirometry machine. They're going to clip your nose, and you're going to breathe through your mouth only. And then the technician is going to say, all right, now I want you to breathe normal about 5 times. So you're going to go inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. On the 5th time, they're going to tell you to inhale as hard as you can. So you're going to go. And then you're going to exhale as hard as you can. And then again, you're going to breathe normal about 5 times. Okay? All right, so now we got all of these graphs right here, which is going to show up into what we call a spirogram graph. And now we can assess, we can analyze that graph. Folks, the normal breathing that we have, the inhalation and exhalation,
Hello.
the normal breathing that we have, this is what we call a tidal volume. And the tidal volume is about 500 mLs of air that we take in and out of our lungs. So when we inhale, 500. When we exhale, 500. Okay? This is a normal, quiet breathing, like what we're doing right now. When we inhale as hard as we can, we are going to have what we call the IRV, or the inspiratory reserve volume. So this value right here, which is the maximum amount of air that we can take inside of our lungs when we inhale as hard as we can. Then when we exhale as hard as we can, we go. Now we're going to get what we call the expiratory reserve volume, or the ERV, which is on average about 1,200 mLs. Now, if I add up the tidal volume plus the inspiratory volume reserve plus the expiratory reserve, we get what we call the vital lung capacity. So the vital lung capacity is an addition of those 3 values, and on average is about 4,800 mLs of air. Now we can see right here below the graph, below the expiratory reserve, we have this area right here in green. This is what we call the residual volume. What is this residual volume? The residual volume is the amount of air that stays inside of our lung after a maximum exhalation. What is this air doing inside of our lungs, guys? The residual volume is keeping the alveoli inflated. Because if we lose the residual volume, our alveoli will collapse. And that's going to lead to a lung collapse. Have you ever heard of people that had a collapsed lung? That is because they are losing the residual volume from the alveoli. Okay? When I add the residual volume to the vital capacity, I get what is called the total lung capacity, and that is about 6 liters of air that goes in and out of our lungs. Any questions, folks? Now, a doctor is going to take a look at these numbers here. He's going to do some calculation. We're going to watch a video in a minute, and they can help you determine what type of lung disease you have, if any. Okay? And we're going to talk more about it in a minute. Now, let's talk about the transport of gases in and out of our lungs. And this is something that I will ask you guys questions in the exam. So I need everybody's attention here, please. What are we looking at right here? We are looking at an alveoli, right there, an alveolus. And here I'm looking at a capillary that is passing right against the alveoli. Okay? Now, when the blood passes through the capillary, guys, and this blood is coming from the right ventricle. Remember, the right ventricle is going to send deoxygenated blood to the lungs, right? And what's going to happen is that when it comes to the capillary, the CO2, start with the CO2 right here. The CO2 will leave the lung, the capillary, and go into the lungs, so that when we exhale, we're going to get rid of the CO2, and the oxygen gas is going to go in the opposite direction. It's going to leave the alveolus and go inside the blood vessel and bind to the heme, to the iron in the hemoglobin. All right, so we have this exchange of gases. Now, what I want you guys to understand is that the CO2 that is traveling in our blood, right, that is coming from the tissues, you know, the blood passes through the tissue, collect the CO2 so we can get rid of it. The CO2 is a waste product. The CO2 do not travel in our blood as CO2. As soon as CO2 comes into our blood, guys, the CO2 is going to combine with water, H2O in the blood, and is going to form a chemical called H2CO3 right here, which is carbonic acid. Okay? Now, this carbonic acid very easily dissociates. This carbonic acid is going to break down into HCO3 minus and CO2. So we have this constant formation and degradation of the carbonic acid. So CO2 binds with water, form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid breaks down into CO2 and bicarbonate, HCO3 minus. So again, most of our CO2 in the blood doesn't travel as CO2. It either travels as carbonic acid or it travels as a bicarbonate, HCO3 minus right here. Now, when this blood is passing through the capillaries of the lungs, we're going to have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And the carbonic anhydrase enzyme is going to break down carbonic acid back into CO2. And now that CO2 can leave the capillary, go inside of the lungs, inside of the alveoli, so that we can exhale that CO2. Folks, you need to know this chemical reaction right here for the exam. I will ask you questions about this in the exam. Again, let's recap what's happening right here. When CO2 enters our blood, CO2 will combine with water to form a chemical called carbonic acid. This carbonic acid is very unstable, and carbonic acid breaks down into bicarbonate, HCO3 minus, and water, and sorry, and hydrogen bond, and hydrogen ions, protons right here. Okay, naturally, it's just very unstable. So what I was saying earlier is that CO2 doesn't travel as CO2 in the blood. It travels as carbonic acid, and it travels as a bicarbonate. When the carbonic acid passes through the capillaries of the lungs, we are going to have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and the carbonic anhydrase will break down carbonic acid into CO2 and water. And now the CO2 can leave the capillary, go into the lungs, and this is happening by diffusion, by the way. It is diffusion that is driving this exchange of gases. And when we exhale, we get rid of the CO2. Okay? Now, what about this bicarbonate right here, HCO3 minus? Folks, bicarbonate is a buffer. Remember when we talked about the pH of blood? And the blood pH varies between 7.35 and 7.45 on the pH scale. It's slightly alkaline. What maintains that very narrow pH is bicarbonate. This bicarbonate here is extremely, extremely important because it maintains the pH of our blood, because bicarbonate is a buffer. Okay? Any questions, guys? All right. Of course not. All right. So now let's talk about some impaired oxygen transports. One of those issues that we can have with our respiratory system, something called hypoxia. What is hypoxia? Hypoxia is when we have low levels of oxygen to a tissue. Now, several things can cause hypoxia. Anemia can cause hypoxia. Why? Because if we have low red blood cells, we have low levels of oxygen gas. Pulmonary diseases can cause hypoxia because if you don't get enough oxygen when you're inhaling, you're not going to have enough oxygen circulating in your blood. Blocked blood or airway circulation can lead to hypoxia. So hypoxia of a tissue is anytime we have low levels of oxygen to that tissue. And a sign of hypoxia is someone turning cyanotic. What is that? Is when we have the bluish coloration of the skin and the mucosa because of a lack of oxygen gas. Okay? Another serious issue with our respiratory system is carbon monoxide poisoning. And I have talked about carbon monoxide poisoning before. Carbon monoxide poisoning is what we call a silent killer. Why? Because we can't smell carbon monoxide. We can't see carbon monoxide. We can't taste carbon monoxide. But when we are exposed to carbon monoxide, the carbon monoxide is binding to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, preventing oxygen gas from binding. And that can lead to death, okay? If you're not removed from that environment and given 100% oxygen gas to breathe. Now, what about the control of breathing? We watched the video earlier today, and we know that our breathing is involuntary. Thank God. So we don't need to think about breathing. We have enough to think already, right? So we can go to bed and sleep at night without worrying about breathing. Now, breathing has both an autonomic control, and autonomic means involuntary, but it also has a somatic control, guys. We can control our breathing. If right now I want to increase my respiration, all that I have to do is contract my diaphragm. The diaphragm is a voluntary muscle. So right now I can do this. And that is voluntary. I'm increasing my respiration rate by contracting and relaxing my diaphragm. So our breathing has both an autonomic and a somatic control. Okay? It's both involuntary and voluntary, right? And in the brain stem, right there in the pons and the medulla oblongata, we have a control center for breathing. Because our breathing is also going to be affected by other factors in our body. Our breathing is going to be affected by the levels of CO2. Our breathing is going to be affected by the levels of oxygen. Our breathing is going to be affected by the pH of our blood. Our breathing is going to be affected by our level of activity. Okay, and all of the signal is going to arrive at the main control center in the medulla, and that is going to innervate our diaphragm and our external intercostal muscles through those two nerves right here. We have the phrenic nerve, you can see here, coming from the medulla center and innervating the diaphragm, controlling the diaphragm. And we have the intercostal nerve that is going to innervate the external intercostal muscles. We know these are the two muscles involved with respiration. When we control the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, we are going to inhale. When we relax the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, we are going to exhale. Now, something very interesting, folks. You know, I know some of you might have kids out there, and let's say that your kid is throwing a tantrum at the mall because they want a toy. They want a Nula Boo Boo. Yeah, I'm sure you heard of those, right? And they're throwing a tantrum, and they turn to you and they said, if you don't give me a Nula Boo Boo, I'm going to stop breathing and I'm going to die. You, as the smart parent that you are, because you took my biology class, you're going to say, go ahead, try it. All right, so they're going to hold their breath. Are they going to be able to hold the breath forever? No, they won't. So let them cry, let them hold their breath, because what's going to happen is that as they hold the breath, the level of CO2 in the blood increases. As the CO2 level increases, guys, you know what's going to happen to the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid? It will become more acidic. It will decrease the pH. Why? Remember when we're talking about gas exchange? When the carbon monoxide reacts with water, it forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, like the name says, is an acid. And the more carbon monoxide we have in our blood, the more carbonic acid is going to be produced. And that is going to cause our blood to become more acidic. And when our blood becomes acidic, our CSF becomes acidic because the CSF is made from the blood. And when the CSF is acidic, that is going to activate the breathing center in the medulla. And you know what the medulla breathing center is going to do? They're going to fire an action potential through the intercostal nerve, and they're going to fire an action potential through the phrenic nerve. What's going to happen, guys? Now, the diaphragm will contract, the external intercostal muscles will contract. What's going to happen? You're going to breathe it. You're going to breathe. Okay? So the main stimuli for our breathing is not even the level of oxygen gas in our blood. The level of oxygen is the second important signal. The most important is an increase in CO2 level in the blood, which is going to cause the blood to become acidic, cause the CSF to become acidic, activating the medulla center and leading to the contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscle, leading to an inhalation. Okay? Any questions, guys?
Yeah, fucking exactly.
Stephanie, you need to, you're unmuting your, we can hear you. All right, so let's talk about some other issues with our respiration. Hyperventilation is caused by high levels of CO2. when we hyperventilate, what we are trying to do, we're trying to blow the excess CO2 in our body. Guys, what happens after we are, exercising? Let's say you start exercise and you run, I don't know, a mile. When you're done with it, you're going to be out of breath, right? You're going to hyperventilate. You're going to go. So what you're doing is you are blowing off the excess CO2 that you are making in your body. Now, when you hyperventilate, if you hyperventilate too much, what's going to happen is that your blood will become too alkaline. And this is why people that are having a panic attack, and you have known, people, they are told to breathe inside of a paper bag, right? What they are trying to do is that they are trying to recycle that CO2 so that your blood doesn't become too alkaline, okay? Some different lung diseases, emphysema, asthma, pneumonia, ARDS. These are all different types of lung diseases. Emphysema is due to a chronic inflammation of the alveoli, which is going to make the alveoli less elastic so they don't expand as they should. Asthma is a chronic inflammation of the bronchial passage due to different irritants. So now the bronchioles, they're going to constrict, decreasing the passage of air. Pneumonia is an infection of the lungs that could be caused by a bacteria, a virus, a fungi, or parasite. And ARDS is something very serious. It's called the acute respiratory distress syndrome. And this is when we have accumulation of fluid build up inside of the lungs because of an infection. And folks, people that died of COVID during the height of COVID-19 pandemic, they died because of ARDS, because of acute respiratory distress syndrome. Okay. Now, what happens to our lungs when we are still a fetus? Our lungs develop very late during the fetal development, guys. Why? Because we don't use our lungs inside the womb of our mothers. Our lungs collapse. So the lung is going to be one of the last organs in the body to fully develop. Now, what happened, and I mentioned this earlier, what happens when we have a premature baby? When you have a premature baby, the lungs of the baby is not fully developed. And that is going to lead to a condition that is called IRDS, Infant Respiratory Distress Syndrome. Okay? Because their lungs are not yet producing the fluid. They're not producing the surfactant that is required for respiration. Right? Now let's watch this video here that describes what happens to our lungs when people are affected by COVID-19 virus.
When you breathe, air flows in through your mouth and nose and down your airways. Inside your lungs, the airways end in clusters of air-filled sacs. These air sacs are surrounded by tiny blood vessels. Here, oxygen from your lungs passes into your bloodstream to get to tissues throughout your body. Carbon dioxide is breathed out. COVID-19 is a disease caused by a virus called SARS-CoV-2. The virus infects cells along your airways by attaching to ACE2 and other molecules on those cells. The virus uses ACE2 as a door to get inside of the cells and make more copies of itself. The virus, and your immune system's reaction to it, inflammation, damages the air sacs, causing them to scar and stiffen or fill with fluid. This blocks some oxygen from passing from your lungs into your bloodstream. As blood oxygen levels fall, you may feel short of breath. In severe cases, a ventilator or other support may be needed. Inflammation helps our bodies fight infection, but in some people with COVID-19, it seems to go into overdrive. Researchers think this may be due to the fact that the virus latches on to the ACE2 molecule in order to get into cells. ACE2 helps reduce inflammation, and this effect is lost when the virus occupies it. The result is that inflammation can go awry. NHLBI-funded research over decades has helped us understand ACE2, its role in inflammation, and how it is hijacked by the virus. NHLBI is also supporting new studies, including clinical trials, focused on developing safe and effective treatments for people infected with SARS-CoV-2. People with chronic lung, heart, or blood diseases may be at higher risk of severe illness from COVID-19. We should all take steps to help protect ourselves and others from infection by washing hands often, avoiding crowded places, wearing a mask, and staying at least 6 feet away from other people. Visit our website for the latest information and resources
All right, guys, any questions?
on
All right, so we are done with another chapter, and the quiz for chapter 13 is open right now, okay? Go ahead and take it. You do have until Sunday night to take it. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.